This, ladies and gentlemen, is how you pull some actual weight. Stay tuned, we're talking form.
Lift with your lower back in a jerking, twisting motion.
Alright, jokes aside, if you want to build real strength, the big three are super important. The big three, if you're not familiar, are the squat, the bench, and the deadlift. These are the three exercises trained at a powerlifting meet, the ultimate test of strength. So if you can be strong at these three exercises, you're gonna be strong almost across the board. In previous videos, I've talked about how strength actually comes from the nervous system. So when you think of performing a strength movement, like the squat, bench, or the deadlift, think of training the movement pattern, and we wanna train this pattern as perfectly as possible. So there's two real aspects to that. Number one is the perfect setup that's gonna get you in the most optimal position to move that load. And then number two is perfect execution. Now the perfect setup has a few components. Number one, you want to get into the strongest and safest position possible. You also want to maximize stability. And I have a cue here that I've used for a very long time that's super helpful, which is think to push through steel as opposed to pushing through a spring. So we want to create sort of a steel base. Imagine pushing some amount of force through a steel rod. All of that force is going to get transferred all the way through the rod, and you're gonna lose almost none of the force. Now imagine if you pushed force through a spring or like a slinky. Almost none of that force is gonna get through the other side. It's actually just gonna compress and bend the spring. So that's our base that we wanna be perfectly solid and stable. In the squat, this is all of your torso and your hips. In the bench press, this is your hips, your glutes, and your scapula on the bench. In the deadlift, this is almost your entire body. The second part of maximizing strength is perfect execution. So I want you to think of each rep when you're performing strength movements as a single. I want you to think of that rep in isolation. So you do that rep perfect, and then you do one more rep perfect. You're not doing a set of 8, you're doing a single, and then another single, and then 6 more. This next one will make more sense over video when you've got a visual. So I'm gonna talk about eccentric setting up the next rep here in a little bit. Final objective with perfect execution is maintaining that stable base. You already established that stable base. You're in the strongest position to start your reps, but you want to maintain that throughout the entire set. Last thing I'll mention here before we get into the practical stuff is that increased power equals increased strength. So if you can move the same load more explosively, you're creating more power and therefore more strength. So your goal with strength training on the concentric, i.e. the work phase where you're working against gravity, should be to move weight as powerfully and explosively as possible. Now don't sacrifice form for this. If you're learning the movements initially, you need to train your nervous system to perform that movement perfectly. And once that movement's ingrained, then focusing on moving that weight powerfully during the work phase, the concentric phase, is gonna provide awesome benefits for your strength. And another key benefit of this is you can get a huge amount of stimulus from loads that are very low below your 1 rep max. You can get a huge stimulus from like 50 to 60% if you're moving the weight as intentionally and powerfully as possible. All right, so we're gonna start with the deadlift because the deadlift is sort of unique in that the concentric or the work phase of the movement actually occurs first. This is different from the squat and the bench press, and we'll come back to why this is important later. All right, first part of the setup here is gonna be stepping up to the bar. We wanna place the bar roughly under mid-foot and make sure our feet are as planted and screwed into the ground as possible. Next, we're gonna start to bring our hands towards the bar by breaking at the hip and hinging our torso forward. So pushing your hips back here, hinging your torso forward. You're not gonna hinge all the way back like you would in a stiff leg deadlift. Once you get your hands to about your knees, you're just gonna drop essentially like a squat for the rest of the movement. But you'll see here that I'm loading tension into my hamstrings, and we want to keep as much tension as possible in our hamstrings. At this point, you'll see my arms are completely straight, my triceps are flexed, my hands are essentially just hooks on the bar, so all of the tension generated through my torso is gonna get transferred through the bar because my arms are straight. I'm also externally rotating at the shoulder and activating my lats as if I'm pulling the bar into my shins. This lat activation is critical because it's going to stabilize your thoracic spine, and it also keeps the moment arm between your hips and the bar as small as possible so it's easier to move the load. Now you're going to finish your setup. I cue this with proud chest, and then you're going to start to pull slack out of the bar. I'm actually pulling the bar slightly off the ground here just to demonstrate, but you can see how this fixes any energy leaks and ensures all of your tension is going to go into the bar once you start pulling. Now you're going to initiate the pull by pressing your feet into the floor and starting to thrust your hips forward. This looks sort of like a squat with the bar in your hands up until you get to about your knees, and then it's a hinge where you're driving your hips forward until full lockout. So one more slow here, and then we'll do a couple at full speed. The bar should be right up against your shins, and I also really like the cue of falling back This keeps the moment arm as short as possible and make sure that you're gonna have as much power as possible throughout the entire movement. All right, so next we're gonna talk about the squat. And here we're referring to the barbell back squat. There's two variations, which I'm gonna cover both of, the low bar squat and the high bar squat. I wanna cover them both because I think they both have a place in a strength routine, as well as different purposes for hypertrophy. So they have some fundamental differences as far as leverage and things like that, but we're gonna cover them both. All right, so let's talk about the setup for each of these. So first we're gonna start with the low bar squat. And this is gonna have the bar placed roughly around your mid traps and kind of sitting on your rear delts like a shelf. This is gonna lead to your torso leaning slightly farther forward. And it's also gonna have a little bit greater emphasis on your posterior chain. This is the variation that you'll see more commonly at a powerlifting event or in a pure strength context, because for most individuals, not all, the leverages are going to allow for a little bit higher absolute load. Now for the high bar squat, the bar is going to be resting on top of your traps. So your trap should really be the only thing other than your hands in contact with the bar. High bar squat is going to lead to a slightly more vertical torso, as well as potentially more quad activation. It's typically thought of as better for hypertrophy, and I tend to agree. Because these variations are so similar, I'll demonstrate with both because they can essentially be cued the same way. But I want to reference something that I mentioned earlier in the video, which was using the eccentric to prep for the work phase of a given movement. So with the squat and the deadlift, because you do the eccentric first and then you do the work phase, I think it's useful to think of your setup as well as the eccentric as preparation for the movement. And mentally, if you can think the movement actually starts when I'm at the bottom of my squat, that's going to put you in a really good mindset to maintain strength throughout your core, which in this case is your hips and your torso. And when you have really good stability throughout your torso by good bracing, that'll create that steel rod effect. And the force that you're generating pressing through the floor will be transferred efficiently up to the barbell. All right, so let's talk through the movement. So as you unrack and step back into your position, choose a stance width that's roughly shoulder width apart. If you've never squatted before, you'll have to play around with this a little bit, but you want to make sure that your toes are tracking with your knees. So if your feet are very wide, you want to point your toes slightly outward, as opposed to if they're very narrow, your feet will be pointing almost straight ahead of you. Don't let somebody tell you there's a universally correct squat stance width. Everybody's body's different. Everybody has different leverages, etc. You're going to break at the hips and the knees at the exact same time. Your torso will start to lean slightly forward, but you want to keep a proud chest. I always use proud chest as a cue for squats. Then once you've reached the bottom, i.e. the hole, you're basically just going to stand back up. And I know that sounds super simplistic, but this is one of the most fundamental human movements. And because of that, it's one of the most intuitive. Couple things from a cueing perspective though. One thing you want to avoid is your knees caving in at the bottom. If this is something you struggle with, cue to push your knees out at the bottom as you come out of the hole. Again, practice the movement perfect. As you perfect it, your nervous system will learn, and that's how you'll develop strength. Now, if you have strength or mobility deficits, that's a different story. Make sure you're addressing those. I'm not going to cover that in this video. Another cue again, proud chest. You can cue this throughout the entirety of the movement. I think it's super important. And then lastly, in terms of bracing, make sure the bar is pulled firmly into your back, seated into a good groove when you start your initial setup. You can also check out the Valsalva maneuver. It's a bracing technique that can help a ton with stability for your squat. And yes, having your knees go over your toes when you squat is absolutely fine. You'll see in this last variation with the green plate here, I have my heels elevated, something that's very useful for a lot of individuals because of decreased ankle mobility. And you can see that because of that, I can move my knees forward further and I can actually keep my torso more upright. All right, that's gonna do it for this one. I'm actually gonna cover the bench press in an upcoming video because I wanna get into a little bit more depth and some of the intricacies about that movement. But if you like this one, as you can see right now, I'm a small channel, so really appreciate any likes or subs. And also drop a comment if there's other exercises you'd like to see, like the sumo deadlift, front squat, overhead press, anything like that. In the meantime, check out this video for a pull-up progression that'll get you stronger and better at pull-ups no matter where you're at. See you guys in the next one.